So I want to now bring in Antjuan Seawright. Antjuan is a CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist coming to us from Columbia, South Carolina. Antjuan, always good to see you, even on this sad occasion. But it is also an opportunity for us to marvel at this incredible American. He was the son of sharecroppers who would rise to become an icon and serve decades in Congress. Tell us how he inspired you.
Well, as you can tell, my spirits are very crushed because John Lewis was a friend, someone I admired and looked up to throughout my political lifetime. I've often heard that very rarely do well-behaved men and women make history. I believe that's true because John Lewis has been misbehaving all of his life. He defined it as good trouble, necessary trouble. And because of his good trouble, because of his getting in the way, because of his necessary trouble, people like me have a place in this little thing we call the American experiment. I would oftentimes see him in our political roundabouts, I will say it that way. And John Lewis, born in February of 1940, Antjuan Seawright, March of 1985. You would think we did not have much in common, but we actually did. He was born in Troy, Alabama, a very small rural town, the southern parts of Alabama. I was born in Swansea, South Carolina, a small rural part of South Carolina. He was the son of sharecroppers. I am the grandson of sharecroppers. So we had those shared experiences that we would oftentimes talk about. He would talk about his day and the challenges from my day, and I would lean on him and learn from him about his experience of yesterday so that I can help shape what tomorrow may look like and hopefully have some influence on today. And so John Lewis meant a lot. People oftentimes refer to him as the conscience of the U.S. Congress, but I would say he was our North Star. He made all of us better, whether you're Democrat, Republican, whether you're black, white, whether you agree with his politics or not. And I think that is what is so unique, and that is what's so special about an American icon and a hero, John Lewis.
You talked about good trouble, necessary trouble. That so exemplified his good mischief, as you said. What lessons would Congressman Lewis want us to take from his life as the fight for injustice that you and I have talked about so often continues in this country?
Well, I think he would want several things. One, he would want us to keep the faith. 2 Timothy is a scripture we would always talk about because every time I would leave him, he always say, keep the faith, little brother. Well, you know what the scripture says. I have fought a good fight. I have finished the course, and I have kept the faith. He would want us to do that. He would also want us to be reminded that he was beaten bloody, skull was fractured. He said in public interviews he thought he was seeing God as he crossed that bridge on Bloody Sunday, all for us to just have the possibility at the right to vote. Here we are in this country, still having some of the same discussions, still having some of the same consequential movements around just a simple right to vote, what he described as the most precious and sacred thing that exists in a democratic society. So he will want us to remember the fight from where we were and the fight to get to where we need to be. August 6th is just a few weeks away. That is the anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. You cannot mention the Voting Rights Act of 1965 without mentioning John Lewis, who was beaten bloody on that bridge in Selma. And the last thing I think he wants us to remember is how all this stuff works together for the good. If it wasn't for John Lewis, CT, and so many others, some names we know and some we do not, if it wasn't for their body of work, perhaps me sitting in a chair on CBS News Network having this conversation about the struggles of today and tomorrow would never be possible. I make no apologies about knowing that I stand on the strong, wide shoulders of so many black and brown people who look like me, who talk like me, who have some of the same shared experiences like me. If it wasn't for their experiences, I would not enjoy the experiences I have today.
I now would like to bring in Congresswoman Fudge. She served Ohio's 11th district since 2008, and she's a former chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. Congresswoman Fudge, I want to ask you about the example that Congressman Lewis brought to the members of the Capitol there, and the ways in which he actually sparred with the president, starting with his inauguration and choosing to sit that out.
Well, one thing about it, the example John said was very different than the one the president. John talked about the beloved community. He talked about coming together. He talked about representing marginalized people. He talked about justice, freedom, with a humility that no one could have ever even imagined someone that was that big a person, a giant of a man, would have. So I would say to you that John brought the kind of courage, the kind of inspiration that I don't know that I've ever seen in my years in Congress and in my many years in being involved as an activist in my own community.
And Congresswoman Fudge, I think for people who didn't have the opportunity to ever interact with the congressman, they might be surprised to know how soft-spoken he could be in ordinary life, how he used his voice, that booming voice, when it mattered, but otherwise, as you said, seemed so humble. And I'm wondering if you could reflect personally on what it meant for you to serve alongside a man who was so integral to fighting for civil rights in this country.
Listen, I traveled with John a number of times. I mean, he liked to have fun. He liked to joke. He loved to dance. He loved music. He liked to sing. He was a man for all seasons. He enjoyed life. He went through an awful lot of things in his young life. But what he showed us is that age is not a barrier to leadership. And you can love what you do and love other people. And he enjoyed every single day that he could make a difference in somebody's life. I mean, he had an easy smile. He just was always fun to be around. He used to sit in front of me on the floor all the time, and he would come by and he'd show me what he had on to make sure that I approved. And we'd laugh about it. Or if he lost too much weight or gained, he'd come by and just stand in front of me. I mean, he just was a fun guy. He was my friend. I love John Lewis, and I'm going to miss him greatly.
It's incredible when a person from history books is actually in front of you and is a real whole person like that. Antjuan, I'm wondering if you want to join this conversation and tell us what lessons Lewis would want us to take from his life and how he saw the idea of civil rights, not exclusively as the domain of just Black and brown people, but he carried on that spirit when it came to LGBTQ rights, when it came to women's rights, and in fighting against injustices wherever he saw them.
Well, I think he had a laser focus on moving people from on the menu to putting them around the table. And I think that's so important. As humble as she is, what the Congresswoman from Ohio, Marcia Fudge, probably did not tell you is that she is the subcommittee chair on voting that was appointed by the Speaker. No one cared more about voting rights than John Lewis. So I know they shared that sentiment. I sent her a message last night of a wonderful photo of them two together. I think was maybe a committee hearing, her doing the work that John Lewis started. And that's the best example of you may start doing something, but you may do it to the point where someone else may carry on the work you started. And then the second thing I think John Lewis would probably want us all to understand is that we all have a role to play. When he started out very young in the movement, he was not out front doing all the heavy lifting as some of the others in the movement. But how time and how the experience would end up is people know him now as probably the mover of the movement because of his body of work. And he went from activist to member of Congress. That may not be the journey for everyone. And he probably had no idea when he was marching and getting in the way and causing trouble, he would end up in the U.S. Congress. But it's a journey that really proves that the American experiment is one that will identify with anything is possible if you do the necessary work and you believe and you stay the course. And I think that's the lesson he will often tell me. We all have not been called to do the same things, but we all play a tremendous role, and we have to really sit down in the role that we have been called to play.
Congresswoman, I think I was going to say, I think that the last time. Oh, please.
You know what? John had a courageous spirit, not just a courageous spirit. And with all the things he did, he never let us forget that civil rights was unfinished business, that voting rights was unfinished business, that racial equality was unfinished business. John made us ask the question, is this one nation or two? One rich, one poor, one black, one white? He never, ever let us forget the journey we still had left to take. I mean, he came a long way, but he never let us forget we had a long way to go. And so that is what made him so special, because he understood, I brought you this far, but I need you to take it the rest of the way.
I think that's well said. And it's part of what I wanted to ask you about. The last time I think most of us saw Congressman Lewis was there across from the White House at Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, D.C., standing there. What was his message to this younger generation as they are trying to take the struggle for civil rights, the fight against systemic racism in our country, the fight against police brutality to the next level?
John was very proud. You know, even though John was 80, he had the spirit of that same 23-year-old, that same person that saw injustice and wanted to right it. You know, he felt he was as young and as strong as they were. And so I think that he took great pride in the fact that young people were carrying on his work. He didn't hold it like it was all his. He wanted to share what he had and who he was with the world, and he did. And so I'm looking forward to seeing the next John Lewis emerge from these marches we are seeing across the country, because all of us want to know that the work that we have done and the work that he did is going to be carried on by somebody else with the same kind of energy and the same kind of courage that he had at 23 years of age.
Different boats, but all in the same boat now. Antjuan, we'd be remiss, though, if we didn't mention another civil rights icon who died on Friday, C.T. Vivian. Can you tell us about the life that he lived?
Well, I think the life he lived spoke very loudly for him. And at the end of the day, people gave him the title of minister. But my grandparents, I learned from them at a very early age. The most powerful sermon any preacher will ever preach is the life they live. And most people rather see a sermon than hear a sermon any day of the week. Mentor to Dr. King, a friend of John Lewis, held up so many young people on his shoulders and positioned them to be where most of us are today. And I told a reporter earlier today, perhaps heaven needed those two to travel together to get up there and cause a little trouble. Because I don't know two more bigger troublemakers than John Lewis and C.T. And so his life spoke for him. I think his body of work will continue to live on. And I am thankful and the beneficiary of blessings that have been passed along by both C.T., John Lewis, and so many others who have gone before me.
Representative Marcia Fudge of Ohio and Antjuan Seawright. A sad day as we mourn the passing of John Lewis, but also a day of joy as we realize that such a tremendous spirit lived among us in our time and contributed so much to trying to fulfill the promise of this great nation. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.